Hello, greetings to all. I'm Dr. Bahia Diefenbach, an English language specialist at the Uzbekistan Scientific Practical Innovation Center. Let's say, for example, you want to find out and investigate why your students they are making certain spelling mistakes in their writing. So you want to do something and think about a plan. You need to design a set of procedures. Before you decide whether the results are useful also and make final conclusions, you want to evaluate those procedures. Let's see another example. For example, another example, we want to cook dinner and make some hummus. So we got the ingredients, but is it enough information? 2 cups of chickpeas beans, 3 garlics, some lemon juice, a pinch of salt. Are we talking about dry, canned, crushed, mashed? Are we talking about cloves of garlic, crushed or a whole? Some lemon juice. How much? How many? Pinch of salt. Mint, leaves or dry or minced. Also, how do we combine all these ingredients? There are so many unanswered questions. Moreover, sometimes and often, in fact, presenting some visual aid will help us understand better. Research and investigation requires a plan with complete information. Now, one important thing, and this is the most important step to design a plan, is to decide on the topic and to develop a question for the proposed study. So think about what different angles the question could be asked and answered. You do need to have a focus that will guide the development of a list of questions. What is your objective? What is the method or methods? Qualitative or quantitative? How will I collect the data? Who will be in the research? Whom are the participants, etc. All these questions should be thought about and planned for. Let's talk about the research writing now. All right, this is how research writing plan. You need to have an introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. Let's look at each component separately. Let's talk about the introduction first. Significance. What do we mean by that? Does the topic appear important to society? Is it relevant? Language. Is the presentation clear and objective? Is the language consistent with the approach used by the researchers? Literature review. Is there balance in the point of view found in the citations? Is there an appropriate time frame? So you start with some older and some current references. Is there a coherent theme? Research questions. Are the questions or objectives clearly identified? So this should be included in your introduction, and these are the questions that you need to ask yourself when you are creating that introduction. Then the next, you go to the methods. In the methods, we have the participants. What? Can you identify the target population? Who? Is sufficient detail provided about the participants? Where? Did the researcher identify the setting? And is that setting appropriate for that research? When did the researchers identify the time period during which the study was conducted? How? The researcher needs to specify how participants are selected, how they were selected, and did the selection procedure appear to be appropriate? Why? was their explanation for why these participants were chosen. Then the procedure. Appropriateness of the procedure. Are these relevant for the research questions, objectives identified for the study? Are these procedures appropriate? And completeness. Was sufficient detail provided about the procedures so that the study can be replicated? The next step, the instrumentation. So all these should be included in the methods. Instrumentation, and then you have to identify what instruments are you going to use. Surveys, forms, tests, all these, the tools, all these tools that are used to gather information should be clearly identified. And then the quality. Do the instruments used to gather all this information, do they appear appropriate and sufficient to describe all the variables that were being studied? So all this information should be included in the methods section. Then comes the results. The results, we look at clarity, where the findings clearly reported. You discuss and describe the results clearly. And completeness, was there any incomplete analysis? And if so, you have to explain the reasons. Why was it incomplete? Finally, the discussion. In the discussion, you have to make sure of the style. Is the discussion clearly written? Relevance. Is it focused on how the findings are related to the objective of the study? In the discussion, you want to make sure that when you are discussing the results and the findings of the study, that they are relevant to your question and your objectives. Conclusions. Do the conclusions follow logically from the results? Based on the results, you are drawing your conclusions. And again, completeness. Are implications, limitations, and recommendations for further research included? This is where you include all that information. So this is the research writing. Let's look at an example. All right, this is a study, a research article that I got as an example. It's a mixed method study of feedback modes in EFL writing. It's written by Dr. Arif Bakla. In his study, there was a section of the abstract, then the introduction, literature review, research questions, method, results, and discussion. These are the parts that should be included in every research paper. Okay, let's look at each part of them. I took some excerpts. Okay, let's start with the introduction. As you can see here, this is the first sentence, and it identifies the topic of the whole research. Researchers and teachers have always considered feedback as an essential part of writing instruction in second language acquisition. So I already know what is the topic of the research. It's considering feedback in writing instruction. For example, and then he gives examples about his research and some literature review. However, and then notice here, audio feedback is abbreviated and screencast feedback is abbreviated, and it's given the acronym because he's going to be using it throughout the whole research paper. What I have here in blue are the transitional words. Notice the beginning of every paragraph, you put a transitional word to make the writing better quality and more coherent. In brief, this is the last paragraph in the introduction. Due to insufficient research with limitations and conflicting findings, there is still need for research on digital feedback modes. So you see, go ahead and he justifies the reason of this research. Again, in line with another transitional word. Literature review, that's our next section. I would like you to notice here the appropriate time frames. He's starting with some older references and then going through the years to some more current references. And then he's also using coherent theme. It's always talking about the feedback and the different types of feedback in the research findings. Notice here that we saw those acronyms. He has presented them in the introduction for the audio feedback, also here for the written feedback. So this will make it easier in the writing. In short, so he's ending the literature review by summarizing in short what were the findings. The research question. Remember we said that the questions should be clearly identified. This is the whole paragraph of the whole section of the research question in his paper, really. Starting, building upon the literature review presented above, this study seeks the answers to the following research questions. And then he lists his research questions. Very simple, straightforward, very clear. And comes the method. The method in the beginning describe briefly about the whole method. And now I would like you to notice here the researcher used the mixed methods, embedded design, etc. In good writing, good quality writing, it is always recommended to use the third person, not to use I or you. So here, although he's the one who's wrote the paper and he's the researcher, but then always says the researcher. Notice in blue is the transitional words always used. And I put in red here for you to get your attention. Look at all the references to visual figures, table, the essays here, saying revise 3 parallel essays, and they will be provided in the appendix. Now also, whenever there is a figure, you have to make sure that you have a title for that figure with a description of what the figure represents. Next part is participants. That's also in the method section. In the participants, I have the picture here of storytelling. Really, the way you describe the participants in the research is like a storytelling. You just describe what, who are the participants, where did they work, or where did they come from, what do you provide them. All the feedback in this study was provided by the researcher. Again, notice he's using the third person. And then, based on these criteria, because you have to decide why you choose these participants, and you have to explain why these specific participants were selected for the study. Next part is the data collection. In the data collection here, you notice from the first sentence, we can tell what he's doing. The researcher collected data using both quantitative and qualitative means. So we know what they're doing, how they are collecting the data. Again, it's always a good idea that to have the appendix in which you have included all the surveys, the tests, all the material used in the study. Again, first, second, transitional words, and then the tables and figures. Data analysis describe clearly quantitative data analysis and describes what they did exactly. Qualitative data analysis, describe exactly. And notice C, Appendix C, for notes on how the research used them. So remember, when someone writes a research paper, you also want to make sure that it could be duplicated, it could be used, and someone can conduct the same research also. I remind you in this methods part, this is where the descriptive statistics that we have discussed previously are very important. This is where all the data is collected and some of these statistics could be used. Finally, the results, not finally, before finally, in fact, the results section. So describe clearly what are the results. Again, reference to appendix and to tables. Discussion. In the discussion, you notice the first question. You refer to the questions. We said already in the discussion that you want to make them relevant in your discussion. They are relevant to the findings, are relevant to the objectives of the study. And it should be clearly written, and the conclusions, they follow logically from the results. Also in the discussion, this is where you have all kinds of implications and the limitations of the study, and recommendations for further research should be included. This is a recommendation. So at the end, based on the results and the limitations of this study, several further research topics could be suggested, and he's suggesting them. Moreover, okay, recommendations for further research. Finally, okay, again, the research writing, we had the introduction, the methods, results, and then discussion. Now that we have seen the components of a research writing, and we have seen an example of a research paper, I'm going to present to you a research template. You may use it when you are writing research papers or sometimes even a research essay. You always start with the title, then an abstract. The abstract is a summary of the whole research. Then you describe the aims and objectives. What are the aims of the study? Is clearly you describe the research question or hypothesis and the specific goals. Then you have the background and significance. What I mean by significance here, I mean that does your study address an important problem? And then you have the display the knowledge of relevant fields, show how your proposed work will extend a research area, will fill a gap, or cover new concerns. Literature review. How, when you plan your study, how did you plan to communicate the gaps in existing researches? How is your planned study important to address the gaps? Okay. Then you have the method. In this method, you choose the methods you would like to employ in data collection and analysis. You give an explanation why you chose this method, why this method, a sample of questions and instruments that you will be using, tests, forms, surveys, etc. And then specifically here, you want to describe the setting. For example, if you're doing a study where you have observations, Then you want to list what locations you're going to observe and when, who will do the observation, how many episodes of observations, who's going to determine that, how long the observations will be, etc. All this will be described here, including we spoke about participants, which is the population characteristics, size of the sample, how many, the criteria, who will be included in the study and who will not, when, where, and how, and the recruitment procedures, how you're going to recruit all these participants in the study. Then you have the data analysis, um, the interpretation. This is where you interpret the analysis and the results, timetable, ethical considerations and limitations. For this one specifically, I'll give you an example. One consideration could be that you told your participants that all information is private and confidential. So how do you assure that? This could be described in maybe a paragraph or a couple of sentences, that how you have dealt with the confidentiality and any other ethical issues that might arise within your study. Limitations, we have discussed before. What are the things that limited were affecting your research? Okay. And then the findings, and in the findings you describe what, in summary, what did you find, and the dissemination part of it and implications. Describe how your research will contribute to the needs of the population, its effects. Now, remember that we have to have the references, follow some style, APA style. Usually we follow the APA style to include the references and acknowledgements. Acknowledgements, this is any people or organization who have assisted, maybe funded your study. So the acknowledgement section is where you kind of thank them and you acknowledge their assistance. Appendices, in that you have the data collection forms and all the instruments, the tests, the surveys, all the assessment instruments that you have used. Now remember that why do we need to include that? In case the study needs to be replicated. Remember, when you conduct a research, you should have in mind also if someone else want to replicate your study, then they should have all these information. I hope this research template is helpful and will guide your planning and designing of a research. Okay, this gets us to the end of this session. And as a small exercise, I would like to match the component to its content. Give you a few seconds. If you need more time, please pause your video and then continue. Okay, here they are. In the introduction, we have literature review, research questions, and the objectives and the hypothesis. In the method, it includes data analysis, participant selection, results will include the findings, discussion will include the limitations. And that, as a summary, I would like to remind you of the beginning when we talked about the recipe. In order to replicate or duplicate a recipe, a research study, we have to make sure that it has been very well planned, designed, right clearly, and make sure it's academic writing, not for the recipe, but for the research study, and present detailed process, and end it with a conclusion. If you notice, it is very similar to the components of an essay. You have the introduction, you have the body of the writing, and then you have the conclusion. Thank you for listening, and I hope that this information was helpful in writing your research papers. If you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to send me a message on Telegram, or we will discuss them during the Zoom session. You have a great rest of the day, and talk to you later. Goodbye.